It was a cold, stormy night when Sarah first heard the story. The rain lashed against the windows of the small cabin, the wind howling outside like a banshee, its fury almost shaking the walls. Inside, the fire crackled, offering a faint warmth against the chill. She was curled up with a blanket, her grandmother sitting in the old rocking chair by the fire. The room smelled of wet earth and wood smoke, the air thick with the sense of an approaching storm. "Grandma," Sarah said quietly, glancing over at the old woman who had always been full of stories. "Do you remember the old house on the hill? The one we're never supposed to go near?" Her grandmother's face went pale, her wrinkled hands tightening around the arms of her chair. For a moment she was silent, her eyes shifting to the window as if listening to the wind outside. Then she sighed, a deep, tired sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 100 years. "I've never told you about that house, child, because it's better you never know. But if you truly want to hear the story—" She paused, looking at Sarah with an unreadable expression. "Then listen carefully." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in anticipation. She had always been curious about the old house, the one that stood at the top of the hill, dark and twisted, its windows broken and its roof caved in. No one had dared to live there for decades, and the townspeople always spoke of it in hushed voices, as if afraid to say too much. "It wasn't always like that," her grandmother began, her voice low and strained, as if the words themselves were heavy with something unspoken. "Years ago, the house was owned by a family, the Wilkins family. They were just like any other family, or so we thought. But there was something about that house. Something wrong." Sarah leaned in, her heart beating faster. "One stormy night, much like tonight," her grandmother continued, "the family disappeared. Just vanished. No one knew what happened. One moment, they were there, and the next, the house was empty. The sheriff searched, but there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints. It was as if the house itself had swallowed them whole." Sarah shivered, the wind outside making the trees sway violently, their branches scratching against the windows like skeletal hands. "Years went by," her grandmother said, her voice growing softer. "But the house, it didn't stay empty. People began to hear things, whispers in the night, screams, footsteps. Some said they saw figures moving through the broken windows, but when they went to check, the house was always silent, always empty." Sarah could feel her skin prickle as her grandmother's words grew more unsettling. "One night," her grandmother whispered, "a group of young men from the town decided they'd had enough of the stories. They went up to the house to prove it was nothing but superstition. They never came back." Sarah's eyes widened in horror. "What happened to them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her grandmother leaned in close, her eyes wide, filled with fear. "No one knows. They were never seen again. But the next morning, there were marks on the ground, deep gouges in the earth, like something had dragged them. Something heavy. Something alive." A silence fell between them, only broken by the sound of the storm outside, now growing more violent. "After that," her grandmother continued, her voice trembling, "the town decided to seal off the hill. No one was ever to go near that house again. People said the house was cursed, that whatever had taken the Wilkins family and the others was still there, waiting. Some even said the house had a life of its own, that it hungered for souls." Sarah stared at her grandmother, too frightened to speak. The wind howled outside, and for a moment she thought she heard something else. A whisper, faint but clear, calling her name. Her grandmother's eyes narrowed as she listened. "Did you hear that?" she asked sharply. Sarah nodded, her body stiff with fear. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the hill, from the direction of the house. "That's no wind," her grandmother said, her voice cold with fear. "It's coming from the house. It never stops. The house calls to anyone who dares listen. And if you ever hear it, you're never alone again. You'll be drawn back to it night after night until it has you. Just then, the wind picked up again, louder than before, almost as if it was alive, as if it was screaming. The cabin door rattled, and Sarah's grandmother grabbed her arm, her grip iron tight. Never go near that house, Sarah. Never. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. The wind continued to howl through the night, the rain falling in torrents, but Sarah could not shake the feeling that something was there, waiting, watching. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her mind, louder and louder, until it felt as though the very walls of